All right, so ever had that moment?
Yeah.
You're driving along, maybe enjoying the scenery, and bam, road work. Instant headache.
Oh, yeah.
But what if I told you we could actually break down the real risks involved in setting up those work zones?
Sounds interesting.
That's exactly what we're doing today. We're diving deep into a document all about risk assessment for, you guessed it, roadwork sites. Think tables, technical jargon, the whole shebang.
So, like a blueprint for safe construction zones.
Exactly. And to guide us through this technical maze, we've got our expert here. They can take even the most complicated stuff and make it easy to understand.
Happy to be here.
So let's jump right in. This document revolves around this thing called a risk matrix. It's basically a tool they use to figure out like how risky a certain part of a roadwork site might be.
Okay, makes sense.
Think of it like a big chart. One side tells you how likely something bad is to happen, and the other side tells you how bad it would be if it happened.
So, kind of like weighing the odds.
You got it. And what's really cool is this document goes beyond just listing potential problems. It actually, like, defines specific terms for likelihood and consequence, to make sure everyone working on the project is speaking the same language.
Right, so no room for confusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about crystal clear communication.
And that's super important when you're dealing with, people's safety.
For sure. So, like, when they say almost certain, they don't just mean it's likely. It's got to be expected to happen over 80% of the time.
Wow, that's pretty high.
Right. But then on the flip side, you have rare events. They can still happen, but we're talking less than 0.1% of the time.
So less than once a decade.
Exactly. But even those rare events, they're still on the radar. They're not just pretending they can't happen.
I see. So they're covering all the bases. And I'm guessing they break down consequences just as precisely.
Absolutely. Let's talk consequences.
So they range from insignificant, which, believe it or not, still includes things like traffic jams, all the way to catastrophic.
And that sounds pretty scary.
Yeah, we're talking major property damage and, sadly, multiple fatalities in those worst-case scenarios.
Okay, that's heavy. Thankfully, those catastrophic events are really rare.
Definitely. But it's important to be prepared for everything.
Absolutely. So we've got these two scales, right? Likelihood and consequence. But how do they, like, work together in this risk matrix?
So picture it like this. You've got this grid where likelihood is on one side and consequences on the other. You take a potential hazard and plot it on the grid based on how likely it is and how bad it would be.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Good. Then the spot where they intersect, that tells you the overall risk level. And that's where the color coding comes in.
Oh, yeah, it's like a stoplight, right? Green for low risk, yellow for medium, red for high.
Exactly. It helps planners quickly see how serious different situations are without having to read tons of text. It's a super visual tool.
So if they see a lot of red on that matrix, it's time to hit the panic button.
Haha, maybe not panic, but definitely time to rethink things. Even if a risk is in the high or medium category, they need to seriously reconsider their approach.
It's not just about tweaking a few things. It might mean completely changing their traffic management strategies.
Exactly. And this is where it starts getting super interesting because it shows you how much thought goes into setting up those work zones. It's not just about throwing some cones down and calling it a day.
There's a real science to it. And those standardized definitions we talked about, they're key. Everyone needs to be on the same page when it comes to understanding how risky things are.
Absolutely. Everyone's going to be speaking the same language.
So say there's a possible chance of minor traffic delays during road work. Based on what we've seen, that would probably be a low risk, right?
Most likely, yeah.
But what if there's a likely chance of a major accident? Suddenly we're talking high risk, maybe even very high.
Yeah, that changes everything.
And that's where those color-coded warnings are so important. A bunch of red on that matrix is basically a giant warning sign.
Totally. Hold up, we got to rethink this whole thing.
Exactly. And what's so cool about this document is it gives us a framework for thinking about roadwork safety in a super systematic way.
It's almost scientific.
All right, so we've got this risk matrix, clearly defined terms, and these visual warnings. But how do they actually use this information in the real world? What are the practical implications?
Ooh, great question. And that's something we'll dive into as we keep going.
I'm hooked. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, we are. There's so much more to unpack. Welcome back. Glad you stuck around.
I'm telling you, this is way more interesting than I thought it would be. Never thought I'd get so into orange cones and risk matrices.
Right. It's amazing what you discover when you look at everyday stuff with fresh eyes.
Totally. So before, we were talking about how this risk matrix helps planners figure out, the dangers of road work. But what happens next? Like, how do they actually USE this info to make decisions about a project?
Okay, so once they've used the matrix to identify and size up the risks, the next step is figuring out what to do about them. And remember, it's not just about fixing each risk one by one.
Right. Got to look at the big picture and, choose a traffic plan that tackles all the risks of the project.
Exactly. And this document actually gives some pointers on that. It suggests a tiered approach to managing risk, so different actions are needed depending on how risky things are.
Okay, so break it down for me. What does this tiered approach look like in real life?
So for risks that are very high or even medium, the document says they got to completely rethink the traffic plan.
Whoa, so we're not just talking about adding a few extra signs or slowing down the speed limit.
Nope, not even close. It's back to the drawing board. Could mean big changes to how the work zone is set up, when they do the work, even what kind of traffic control they use.
Wow, those higher level risks really make them rethink everything.
For sure. Shows you how seriously they take those red zone situations. Not messing around. They want to find ways to make things genuinely safer.
That's good to know. Really put safety first, not just getting the job done quickly.
Absolutely. But what about those smaller risks, the ones that are low or negligible? Those got to be dealt with somehow, right?
Yeah, good point. I mean, as drivers, we run into those low-level risks all the time, like small delays, lane closures, that kind of thing.
Right. And while those risks might not need a total traffic plan makeover, they still got to be addressed.
So how do they handle those less intense risks?
It's usually more about reducing the impact, not redesigning the whole thing. Think of it as adding extra safety measures to make sure nothing happens, even if the overall risk is pretty low.
Got it. So things like more signs, temporary barriers, maybe lowering the speed limit through the work zone.
Bingo. Creating a safer environment for everybody, even in those less dramatic situations.
I'm starting to see how this risk matrix is a tool for, thinking through every possibility, from the worst-case scenarios to the everyday annoyances.
Exactly. It's all about being ready for those what-if moments and having a plan for whatever comes up.
And it's wild to think that all these decisions come from this, almost scientific approach to figuring out risk.
I know, right? Super organized. And hey, speaking of being organized, there's one part of this whole process we haven't even talked about yet. Communication.
Oh, yeah, that's huge GE.
Right. What good is a perfect traffic plan if no one knows about it?
Exactly. You got to communicate effectively at every step, from letting people know about upcoming road work to giving drivers clear instructions on how to get through the work zone.
Totally. We're talking roadside signs, those electronic message boards, maybe even public service announcements, anything to get the word out.
And they have to reach so many different people, too. Drivers, yeah, but also pedestrians, cyclists, people in wheelchairs, everyone.
Absolutely. The info needs to be clear and easy to understand for anyone who might be affected by the work.
Which isn't always easy, let's be honest. Think about those detour signs.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I swear they're designed to confuse you.
Haha. Tell me about it. Clear and consistent signs are super important, especially in those complicated work zones where you might end up on a road you've never been on before.
It's not just about warning people about the construction. It's about guiding them through it safely.
You got it. And that takes a crazy level of detail and attention that we as drivers probably don't even realize.
It's like there's this whole hidden world of planning and communication going on behind the scenes, and it's all about keeping us safe.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about this document. It gives us a peek into that world, a world we don't usually think about but rely on every single day.
I know, right? It's definitely made me more aware of how complex something as simple as road work really is.
And that awareness makes us all safer and more responsible drivers.
All right, so we've talked about the different levels of risk management, how important communication is, and how this all plays out in the real world. But before we go any further, I want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your experiences with road work? Ever been in a situation where you felt like they handled the risks really well? Or maybe a time where you thought, something feels off here. Think about your own run-ins with those orange cones, and we'll be right back for the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. I gotta say, I'm looking at those orange cones a little differently now. Not just a pain in the neck, but a whole system designed to keep us safe.
That's the shift we were hoping for with this deep dive. Easy to get annoyed by road work, but once you see how much thought goes into it, maybe the frustration fades a bit.
For sure. So before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of what we learned about how they assess risk for roadwork.
Sounds good to me. What should we hit first?
Well, the biggest thing for me was that risk matrix. Breaking down potential problems by how likely and how bad they could be, and the color coding. Genius. Green for low risk, red for high risk. It's like a stoplight for safety.
Yeah. And it's not just a fancy chart. It really does guide the decisions they make. Remember that tiered approach to risk management we talked about. High-level risks might mean completely changing the traffic plan, while lower-level risks can usually be handled with simpler strategies.
It's all about finding that balance, right? Keeping traffic moving, but also making sure everyone's safe. Not an easy task.
Nope, definitely a balancing act. And that's where communication is so key. You could have the best traffic plan in the world, but if drivers don't know about it, it's useless. All those signs, the message boards, they're essential parts of the whole thing.
One thing that really stood out to me was how much emphasis they put on planning ahead. They're not just reacting to problems as they come up. They're trying to predict those problems and design traffic plans that avoid them in the first place.
It's like they're playing chess, thinking several moves ahead to avoid those checkmate situations.
Exactly. That level of foresight and planning can make a huge difference when it comes to safety.
I think that's one of the biggest things we learned from all this. Road work isn't just about throwing up some cones and crossing your fingers. There's a ton of expertise, technology, and careful thought involved.
You know, it's funny, we started this deep dive talking about how those orange cones can be such a pain, but now I'm looking at them with a whole new level of respect. They're not just obstacles. They're signs of this big, complex system that's designed to protect us.
I love that way of looking at it. And hopefully now that we all understand that a bit better, we'll be a little more patient and understanding the next time we see those orange cones ahead.
Totally. And maybe even a little more aware of how we can do our part to stay safe in those work zones.
Exactly. We all need to pay attention, follow the signs, and be aware of the workers and other drivers around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the surprisingly fascinating world of roadwork risk assessment. It's been an eye-opener for sure.
It has. It just goes to show that there's always something interesting to learn, even about the most everyday stuff.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. We take those everyday things, dig into them, and find the hidden stories and insights.
Hopefully sparking a little curiosity along the way, and maybe even changing how you see the world.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, stay curious.